you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pamela. It's a huge pleasure to be here at the Asia House Bargary Foundation Festival and to be talking to Hanif Kureishi, one of the most important, but I would also add one of the most entertaining British writers of the past few decades. Someone who's always been there for, certainly for me, for many years, not just as it were, a weather forecaster about what's going on in our culture, but to some extent a weather maker as well, someone who is responsible for his own slightly more benign version of climate change. Hanif, it's always hard to know how to introduce him because he has done so much and over such an incredibly broad spread of literary and cultural activities. Obviously, he was brought up in Bromley, south of London. He studied philosophy at King's College London. From quite an early age, he worked in the theatre, specifically at the Royal Court in its great days. He wrote the screenplay for My Beautiful Laundrette, which has turned out to be a gift that keeps on giving because a new version has just opened in recent months. That was followed by other films such as Sammy and Rosie Get Laid, London Kills Me, on through The Mother, The Weekend. And as a novelist, of course, he has moved on from The Budge of Suburbia through The Black Album, Intimacy, The Last Word, The Nothing. But it's also important to emphasize he's been, I think, consistently a brilliantly perceptive cultural essayist, someone who's taken the temperature of our times and noticed how they change for good and sometimes for not so good as well. And of course, he's also a prolific short story writer. The volume of his collected short stories is one that I return to with enormous pleasure and enlightenment many, many times. And to some extent, all of these strands have been wrapped up in What Happened, his latest book, which contains short stories, it contains essays, it contains criticism and personal reflections on the art, the culture, and the wider political events of our time. So although not a huge book in bulk, it's both enormously wide-ranging and wonderfully crammed and packed with ideas. And I think it might be a nice idea to begin by hearing Hanif read a short section, maybe from one of the stories in the volume.
Thank you, Boyd. Thank you for that introduction. Boyd and I had a bet earlier on when we were sitting here doing the sound check. We were teasing one another. And I've got to get Boyd during the course of the evening to say the words Jacob Rees-Mogg. So if you see me wobbling and wibbling around here trying to get him to say it, that's going to be a good 500 quid in my pocket. He, on the other hand, his challenge was much easier, was to get me to say the word Brexit, which wasn't so difficult, Brexit. Right, this is the beginning of a little story I wrote called "The Billionaire Comes to Supper," about a couple who get obsessed with a billionaire. It wasn't until they had to paint the living room wall that they realized that the billionaire was a billionaire. Both Luna and Shiv had been leaning their bicycles against the wall, and when the flat's owner, a good friend, informed them he was coming back to repossess the place at the end of the month, they thought it would be courteous to repaint the scuffed surface before they left. Shiv used the living room to teach, and the painting work was not finished when the billionaire arrived for his lesson. He was learning Led Zeppelin's When the Levee Breaks. He looked at the empty white surface and said, "I should get you something for that space." Pupils often brought wine, biscuits, oranges, or flowers. But the next time the billionaire came, his driver accompanied him into the flat with a large framed and excitingly dramatic photograph of Jimmy Page, signed by the photographer. The billionaire took it from his driver and handed it to Shiv. "This is for your wall," he said, "with gratitude and apologies for all the bum notes you've had to endure." Shiv thanked him, leaned the photograph against the wall, and completed the lesson. When the billionaire left, Shiv looked at the picture for a long time, shifting it here and there. He texted the billionaire his amazement, saying it was the loveliest thing he had owned. Luna taught piano in schools around the area. Shiv mostly taught in the large flat they'd had for a low rent the past year, owned by a guitarist who was on tour with a musical. Shiv had had good fortune in recruiting a significant number of private pupils from nearby. If the students were young, he went to their houses. Several parents, bankers, surgeons, executives, had also asked for lessons. One of them had recommended him to the man who became known to them as the billionaire. The billionaire, apparently, had grown up loving the blues and R&B and needed someone to help him improve. He'd been Shiv's student for a couple of months, sometimes coming twice a week. Well, that's just the beginning. You can read the rest.
And if you do read the rest, you'll find that it's a lovely story, quite a disturbing one. It touches on themes, motifs that you find in Hanif's work over a long period of the relationship between art and money and power and class, and all set, as so often in his work, in a beautifully observed London. Now, Hanif, you've been a chronicler of London since you started, and one of the points that emerges from The Billionaire is that the power balance between the rich and the rest has changed. Maybe you could say a little more about that compared to the kind of London life you were describing in the 80s and the 90s.
Well, I live in West London, and in not a particularly salubrious part of West London, but I've got a room upstairs, and now I've got some very strong binoculars. I can see right down the street. And in the morning, I get a very, very good gander of what's going on the street. So I am an observant writer from a convenient spot. And one of the things I became aware of is that it would be almost impossible for this couple in the story, Shiv and Luna. They are middle class. They come from a professional background, and they are both music teachers. What they become more and more aware of is that, let's say, ordinary professional middle class teachers like them, it's impossible for them to live in London, even in a formerly wretched place like Shepherd's Bush, and they become more and more outraged by this. That you know, an ordinary house would cost you more than, you know, let's say 2-3 bedroom house would cost you more than £1 million. And so they run into this billionaire, and they can't believe for a moment that the billionaire couldn't give them, let's say, £1 million. I mean, he wouldn't even notice if he gave them £1 billion. It wouldn't mean anything to him, and they become more and more outraged, as it were, by their relative deprivation. And indeed, it's one of the things you notice about the area of London that I live in, that it's mostly people who are quite wealthy, and everybody else is quite downtrodden and poor. And so there are a lot of people sleeping under the railway arches, a lot of people taking crack, a lot of mad people gibbering and jabbering as though all the lunatic asylums have been opened onto Shepherd's Bush Green. And it's just that difference, which, of course, is something that most people would be aware of. I just wanted to embody it in this little story of a couple who can't really find a place in their city anymore, and their sense of outrage and the fact that there's no one to complain to. There's nothing they can do. They are powerless unless they become criminals.
But you use the word paralyzed, but if we backtrack to the early stage of your career, where you had your young heroes, heroines fighting against various kinds of inequality, of deprivation, but doing so in a spirit of creative rebellion, as if they could actually achieve something. Has that changed? Are the barriers, the disparities now so intense that the kind of punk era mutiny or post-punk mutiny, the kind that often surfaces in your work, is that really possible anymore?
It's an interesting question. I'd like to know what you think in a way, because you could say that what you call which was before that the counterculture, and then what you might call the punky ethos, it's certainly, you might say, changed the culture. But whether it has any of that has any agency over the economic world is another matter. And the other question is whether democracy has any agency over the, let's say, the neoliberal or the economic world. And so you might say one of the reasons we have something like political correctness is that we can have agency over our campuses, over the way we speak, over the way we address one another, over the language and so on. But actually, there's very little we can do about Facebook or Google or about the economic system. And so that sense of impotence, which we are living through now with the, I'm going to say it, Brexit crisis, is really interesting. Is there anything we can do? Do we have any real power? And we see it with Extinction Rebellion and so on. You can see the attempt to influence, let's say, those who control the economics. Yeah. But that sense of hopelessness is something that almost impotent. I'm interested in writing about, certainly in this story, which concerns people who would, let's say, who are middle class, who would expect to be listened to, who would expect to have a place in the world. And I'm interested in the sort of the churning of identities at the moment. You might wonder why everybody's so concerned about issues to do with identity. It's because, in a sense, everybody's identity is you might say, up for grabs.
But can you imagine at the moment the kind of culture-changing upheaval that you have written about in previous decades, whether it's the era of Bowie or the era of punk or Prince later on? Are the conditions still in place that would allow those sorts of movements to gain real traction? If you look at something like Extinction Rebellion, is it in the same line as those previous great explosions of need and of desire?
Well, it would be awful to say that it's all hopeless, wouldn't it? It would be an awful thing, and it would be depressing to say that it would be hopeless. But in the morning, when you put separate your rubbish into the various bins, as I'm sure good people here like me do dutifully, and you think, should that go in that thing? Should that go in that thing? And you think, it's important that I do this, and it is utterly hopeless that I do this. This is both a gesture of stupidity, and I will do it because it's important to do it at the same time. One feels both of those things at once, and I guess one of the things you try and do as a writer is to show the contradictory nature of all that we live in, the belief that we have free will, the belief that we have agency, the belief that we can make an impact on things, and at the same time, we know that there's a kind of foolishness about that, rather like pushing those buttons on the traffic lights, isn't there? When you stand on the crossing, you push the button, and I always push it 3 times. I think it'll work 3 times as quickly, but clearly it doesn't have any effect at all.
Yeah. Let's go back to the early stages of your writing career, where you took inspiration not so much from the contemporary literature, certainly in Britain, but from everything else that was going on, from the pop, the fashion, the film. What was it about those forces that made them so creatively fertile, and specifically for you?
I think when I started to write when I was a teenager, and then later when I was trying to write The Buddha of Suburbia, I was trying to find a way to integrate my interest in pop, in Jimi Hendrix, fashion, drugs, clothes, the sexuality I saw in the suburbs and in London, and trying to put that into a book. Because the books that I'd read before, often about young men coming into the city and so on, they hadn't really been about pop culture. And there are books like Salinger and early Roth that are kind of a bit like that. And the challenge for me as a writer, for any writer, is how do you get all this stuff that you're thinking about into one story? And it took me ages to do. And finally, when I got to my late 20s, I was writing The Buddha of Suburbia, I think I found a voice, which is that character Karim Amir speaking when he says, "My name is Karim Amir, I'm an Englishman born and bred," almost. I thought, that's it. It's the comma in that sentence that does the trick, and I like that sentence. So you find a voice, and through which you can then speak about all the numerous different things that you're interested in, and you can shove them in a book. But that's the struggle for being a writer, is trying to work out how to take these anomalous bits and pieces and work them into one story and to find a voice to speak through. And it's got to seem effortless, but in fact it kills you to find it, and it takes ages. It takes you 10 years to get to that. But I grew up in the suburbs, and the only culture we have is what really came through the radio and through magazines like Rolling Stone that we would pick up at Victoria Station and so on. So we knew that out there and in London, the Beatles and in America, they were doing stuff that was reaching us in some distant echo. And I wanted to put that experience into a book, as well as the experience of being a mixed-race kid with a father who'd come from India. How do you put all that in a book? Well, it's a stretch.
But previously, for instance, in My Beautiful Laundrette, some of these themes had already been developed. I'm interested that it's now been revived, that it's been touring again. Looking back from this distance, how does it strike you? Do you still recognize yourself in the way that it's been presented for a new generation?
There's a theatre version of My Beautiful Laundrette that's just opened in Leicester, and it's going to Coventry. I think it's on at Leeds at the moment. It's travelling around. And I became very fond of the director, a fellow called Nikolai Foster, a wonderful man. And he persuaded me to write some new bits, quite a lot of new bits. And I wrote this when I was 27, and now I'm not 27 at all. So it was a bit odd to go back to it and read all this dialogue and try and think yourself into the person who wrote all this stuff and try and remember it all. But actually, once I got going, I put a lot more, lots of jokes in, and I rather enjoyed doing it. But it was an odd experience. But actually, when you see it in the theatre, it doesn't look like a sort of heritage piece. It doesn't look that dated. I mean, there's lots of racism and gay sex in it, and you think, well, it could be today. Particularly the racism and the nationalism and the hatred and I remember Stephen Frears, when we did the film, he said the really deprived people in this film are the white working class, the kids, the skinheads, rather like the kids that I grew up with. They have really become, you might say, disenfranchised now. There really isn't much of a place for them, particularly in places, at the seaside and Margate and Hastings, where I know a bit. And so that was interesting to write more of. The immigrants, people like my dad and all the other immigrants, and Priti Patel's dad. We came to Britain with a real sense of energy. My dad was really excited to be here. He thought, this is such a great place. We can do stuff here. Let's get going. Let's do this. And his mates were buying shops and buying more properties and doing this, that, the other. So there's a lot of energy in the immigrant that wasn't, certainly in the suburbs where I came from, in the host community, that had become rather deadened.
And you touch on the way that the racism sadly seems familiar. There are several essays, wonderful essays here, where you're talking about, as it were, the difference between then and now. Are we, as you perceive it, are we seeing a recurrence, a revival of something that's very familiar to you, or does that kind of xenophobia and nationalism wear distinctively 21st century clothes now?
Most of the racism that I knew, that I was aware of when I grew up, was street racism, was casual racism, or was the teachers. The teachers called him, come on, Packy, go and sit over there. It was like that. It was every day. And people just had contempt for you, and you were afraid of that. And I saw it particularly in my dad, who looked up to white people. He looked up to white people as the standard of what a great human being should be. And he was an Indian, and he knew that they considered him to be inferior, and that made him really annoyed with them, and also sycophantic. So you could see the whole colonial relationship, in individual relationships. But the racism that we have today, which is political racism, for me, is of a different order. I mean, obviously we had the BNP, the National Front, and all of that stuff, and of course Enoch Powell. But the idea that the millions of people would vote for right-wing parties was not at all on the agenda when I was a kid. So there's a resurgence of racism in a way that is absolutely terrifying to me and to my family, and particularly in Britain with Nigel Farage, or say Jacob Rees-Mogg, Boyd. That it's become acceptable in a way, or even the Prime Minister would say things that are quite clearly insults. So it's returned in a new way that's terrifying to me, and certainly for my kids, and should be for all of us here.
What do you think the faced with racism expressed by pseudo-Victorians in three-piece suits, who will be nameless? What is the best artistic response to this? As a writer, is it simply to go on producing the essays, stories that show that their ways of reading the world simply do not correspond with how it's lived or how it's understood?
Well, I'm a writer, that's all I can do. I remember being a kid and going home from school and thinking, this is so horrible, but I can write about this, and going into my room and get my typewriter out and typing it up and thinking, this is so horrible and I feel so claustrophobic and overwhelmed by it. But then I thought, I can write a story about this and I can send it out there and somebody will respond to this. And so I began to work on stuff that was a bit like the Buddha of suburbia. And then I ran into somebody the other day on the street near me, and they said, oh, thank you for writing The Buddha of Suburbia. That book meant a lot to me. And I thought, well, when I went into my room and wrote that book, that was the reason I did it. So there was some connection. So that's all I can do. That's the bit that I can do, which is to speak about this and connect to other people who will understand it. It'll mean something to them. Okay. That's not a political movement, but the political movement stuff is the most important thing. And that's, why we have to join parties and unite with one another and in a sense, put away our identity politics aside a bit and join together to fight against this stuff, which is very, very disturbing. Yeah.
It's interesting you should say that it requires a move beyond identity politics, because you've written about how in the 80s, as you were coming to maturity as a writer, there was, as it were, a non-sectarian, non-religious category of being a British Asian, which was open to you, which was politically articulated. And then the period of the Salman Rushdie fatwa, and afterwards that splintered into what you might call confessional identities, religious identities. Do you think that's irreversible, or could...
Looking back, you might feel quite nostalgic about the term Asian. I mean, it's a bit vague, isn't it? I mean, it's quite a big place, and there are at least, 45 Asian countries, you might say. It's like calling somebody European, but actually now calling someone, if you say you're European, actually, it actually does come to mean something. So I was a big fan of identity politics because I grew up not having an identity, or having an identity that was given to me by other people who told me what I was. So I got very interested in identity politics because I thought, I'll get my own identity. I won't be categorized by you. I'll call myself a writer. And they give you other identities. Post-colonial is one that particularly irritates me, actually. But I don't mind them. So I could see why one would want an identity and might fight for it against other people's view of you. But I do think that we have to put this stuff to one side and find what unites us as a group in the struggle against, the fascist movements that we're all perfectly aware of in Europe today.
Another thing that your work has done brilliantly is to look at what happens to people who are fighting back, resisting that racism, and do it through a very narrow prism of who they are or who they should be. We look at the Black Album or My Son the Fanatic, a story that became a film. You seem to have got there almost before anyone else, that understanding of what can happen to people who have been pushed so hard that the very, very restrictive idea of identity becomes their way of resisting. But what's fascinated me that in this book, you're suggesting at one or two points that kind of new wave fundamentalism may be a generational thing that could be on its way out. Is that what you believe?
I wonder about that now. I was very interested in what's called fundamentalism, particularly in the 90s when it first started. And I was very shocked by it. I was very shocked by how, as it were, a whole community can be abused by an ideology. And I remember going to various meetings and talking from a so-called liberal point of view. And I realized that they just destroyed you. They just destroyed your arguments. They were so aggressive. And I remember reading in Ed Hussein's book that they used that as a policy to just destroy liberals. And I was very shocked by the corruption of a whole community, as it were, and how difficult it was for Muslims, liberal Muslims, to fight back against fundamentalism. And that has really interested me. How few demonstrations by Muslims there were, let's say, in favor of Salman Rushdie. Because if anybody who needs free speech, it's people who live in Islamic countries. It's crucial. You would have thought they would have defended it. So I was very interested in how the community was taken over by radical ideas and how difficult it was for people to speak. I do tend to think that younger people now are less likely to turn to radicalism. And we have another kind of radicalism now that you'll be aware of, which is white radicalism, which is a right-wing radicalism, which seems to have seized the community. So I'm very interested in how it is that people are not, let's say, critical or lose their ability to be doubtful. or lose their ability to wonder about things. The one thing that I really hate as a writer is certainty. It's certainty, who are people who are convinced they know something and have access to the truth.
One of the ways, for me, that you manage to undermine that sense of certainty is in many stories, and there's a lovely story here about a refugee called Nowhere, where, in other words, this sense that the foreigner can be yourself. There's a lovely line in that story where you say, we are all potential foreigners. Is this perhaps one of the functions that you as a writer can fulfill, to show that even to the people who feel that their sense of self and belonging is very settled and fixed, that is temporary, like anything else in life?
Yes, I was wondering about that, because as a young man, and certainly with my father and my family, I think we felt that we were slightly odd, we were different, we were not like other people, and we didn't quite have a place, we had to make a place. And then we thought, but everybody else has a place, they know who they are, they're lucky, they belong here, they have their families, they're settled here. And then as you get older, you realize that certainly in the world that we're living in now, that more and more people, nobody feels that they really have a place, that they don't belong. So the story I wrote about the billionaires was about a white, well, almost white, a middle-class couple who don't feel they have a place either anymore, and that this sense of permanent revolution, of permanent displacement, is something that I wanted to write about, that is caused by, partly by Brexit, partly by neoliberalism and populism and the age of extremities that we're living in now.
Can we flip that around in a slightly more positive way? In that your early work, and you return to it here, talking about the Bromley you grew up in, there is this wonderful but also mortifying sense of sheer boredom, of life happening elsewhere, and you being desperate to find where that was. In the contemporary pieces here, you are describing as we were saying, the kind of chaotic hubbub of London, and whatever it is, it's not boring in the same way. So how far have your youthful hopes of living in a cosmopolitan metropolis been fulfilled? And what, apart from the disparities of wealth and poverty, what are the other unforeseen consequences of inhabiting that kind of global city?
I think I liked it better before. It's got so super rich now that you really feel that the cosmo, you come from the suburbs, you go to London because you think, at least in London there are other people like me, and from here and there, and it's more mixed than, as you put it, cosmopolitan. Then you realize that the cosmopolitanness is beginning to be pushed out by money, and that actually the cosmopolitanness that we had in the 90s and the early so-called noughties, maybe that's over. I mean, I really liked it in London when we had what we call free movement, soon to be ended on Saturday, I hear. And people from all over Europe were coming to London, and you'd go into a cafe and it would be full of Italians and Spanish and Poles and so on, and you got a real sense that London was full of people who were doing stuff and wanted to come here, and it was a really great place to be. I don't get that sense anymore, and it's getting a bit shabby, and certainly in my area, more tatty. I mean, all I do is look out the window, but I can see quite a lot. If you look at one street in London, I like the idea that you can look at one street and sort of take the temperature there and get some sense of what's going on. So I wonder if that's over, or whether that might return after, if we do and don't have the Brexit.
Yeah. And I think we need to talk about how these massive changes in the fabric of our lives are best captured in your work, because there's again a lovely phrase in this book about the most appropriate art for this any kind of era of drastic change being both experimental and popular, and it strikes me that this is something that you've always tried to do. You've used popular forms, but never in a slavishly inherited way. You've always tried to, as it were, ally them to the to more avant-garde traditions. And where does that come from? Was it there in your early work? Is it if you look at you use it particularly in connection with David Bowie? And
What I
wondered
love,
whether-
yes, I think
yes.
what I really love is art that is popular, that reaches a lot of people, but that is both that is avant-garde, experimental at the same time. So I remember listening to the middle period of the Beatles and thinking, you know, he's written a song called "I Am the Walrus," but this is on the radio, and I'm going to buy this, and everybody's going to buy this. And of course, you find that in Hitchcock. Of course, you find that in Miles Davis, and of course you found it in Bowie, particularly in the later Berlin period. It seems to me that making an art that is for a lot of people was always important, and I grew up on that. But making an art that is still difficult and fascinating and says something new, also, that seemed to me to be let's say, the gold standard of what you could achieve. And because I teach creative writing, I'm always caught with the students between somehow wanting them I want them to write for the market. Creative writing students are they're a bit secluded. I mean, they write, you know, they really write for themselves and for you. They don't really have a sense of an audience, and I really want to get them out and to write for other people. I want them, you know, look at George Simenon, a writer I love and I write about in here. You know, he writes some of his hard novels are wonderful. They're really great novels. And they're for you to read on the train. Yeah. And I love the idea that you can do both of those things at once, that people do want to have demands made of them. They do want the good stuff. And it can be popular at the same time. That, to me, is fascinating. And I find that in television. In good television, where there is really good writing, good acting, but also you really feel that this is work, particularly in a show like Mad Men, made by somebody who really is an artist.
Yeah. Let's talk a bit more about that, because you have an essay praising this incredible explosion of long-form TV and the way it's become almost the paradigmatic art form of our times for so many people.
It's not. It's over now. Actually, they don't make the long stuff anymore. I mean, I watched Mad Men, and I found it too short. But I think it's about between 70 and 80 hours long. You know, it took me weeks of my life to sacrifice to Don Draper, and I have to say it was worth every moment. But I don't think they would make a show that it would be between 60 and 100 hours long now. I actually think that's over. Or The Sopranos and the other one, The Wire. Actually, you know, most shows are about 10 hours. You know, and when I'm watching it with my girlfriend, I think, God, it's only 10 hours. I would hardly, you know, I would hardly have sat down for that.
Yeah, yeah. So what does I'm thinking about the aesthetics of that kind of TV. What does the ability to expand bring to the creative process? What does it give you that are more
As a writer,
yes.
as an artist, well, I wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
I haven't got the energy to sit down and write 10, 20 hours of something. I would never do that. I mean, I'm lucky if I can write 4 pages, it seems to me, and that's why my books are so short. It seems to me to be an amazing achievement. But I love those long forms because they're like what we loved in the 19th century novel.
Yeah.
You know, you go inside people's minds and you see the world. Yeah. And that seems to me to be really what the novel and what great television is about. I want to see people in the world and the way the world makes them who they are and the way they resist the world.
Yeah. And have you considered writing one yourself? I mean, 10 hours, if not 80 hours?
I did write one, actually. I wrote one with my son called The Driver, and I was much talked about by the BBC over the whole thing, and I just thought, it's just a nightmare of dealing with executives and other people, and I'm much too sensitive to have to want to go through all that, actually. But other people are tougher than me, and they can do it.
What about if Netflix came along with an idea and creative freedom?
Maybe. I mean, I've more or less given up working in television and film because there's so much money involved, there's so many other people involved, and I really don't want to be messed about by other people now. So I write privately for myself what I want to write, and it's fun for me to do. Going to meetings and having to listen to other people's opinions at my age, I just find unbearable now. Just unbearable. You feel like, and honestly, it makes you so enraged. You feel like, just fucking write it yourself, then. If you got so many good ideas, then you do it, and you think, I can't go into a meeting in that state of mind and say that to the head of drama at the BBC. And you've got to be nice to them as well, obviously. It's even worse. Can you imagine the humiliation?
Well, you may say that, but there are some beautiful passages in here about the Beatles as a model of collaborative art and the achievements that a group, an ensemble of creative personalities can reach that they would not be able to reach single-handedly. And you've collaborated all your career in theatre, in film, in TV, even as an editor of Faber Book of Pop. So clearly there are ways in which it can work for you.
I'm writing something about the Beatles now, and I was just thinking about that. What a wonderful and terrible thing it would be to be able to do only your best work with somebody else who you hated. And which is what happens in lots of rock bands, and you're really tied to them, and you can only do this brilliant thing with them. And once you can't do it with them, your work really drops off. And I've been thinking about that dependence and the pleasures of collaboration. It's a wonderful thing. I mean, I'm writing a movie at the moment now, a new movie called The Curves. I'm writing it with one of my sons, and it's about him and his generation. He's incredibly rude to me, and I can be rude to him as well because we're related. And it's really good fun to collaborate with other people, because you suddenly realize there are only things you can do with other people. And as a writer, you wonder, do I want to be solo, or do I want to work with other people? Actually, the real pleasure is to do both, is to work with other people. I mean, working with Stephen Frears, for instance, on My Beautiful Laundrette, I was young then, it had a big impact on me as an artist. He really helped me develop as a writer. And so if you want to talk about teaching and how you might learn from other people, he taught me a lot about writing, and he really encouraged me. As he used to put it, he'd say, "Oh, make it more dirty." I'd say, "Have you got any notes?" "Oh, make it worse, make it more violent, make it more cruel," he used to say. And I loved him saying that. They were the best notes I've ever had in my life, because he just wanted you to be more of yourself as an artist. And that really cheered me up, because if you're nervous like me, you spend most of your life thinking, well, should I say that? Is it all right? Should I write that bit? Should I take that out? And he just says, indulge. And that was a great note, and it helped me get over my numerous inhibitions as a writer.
Yes, in the book you talk about the necessity for any artist to overcome the superego, the voice within you which is telling you that you're not good enough, that you'll never amount to anything, the voice of self-censorship. But you also write about how that liberation has to be allied to a sense of discipline, of craft. What are the best ways of making those things work in tandem?
You need, in the morning, basically you write it all down, and in the afternoon you take it all out again. That's what you're doing. I mean, I spend ages writing a long story, and then I've written a long story that I'm working on now, and all I do now is cut it. So you put it in and take it out. But actually, all artists do that. What you want to do is to boil it down, is to reduce it, to make it sharper. But you've got to put it in first, and then you cut it out again. And I think, God, why did I put this in the first place, if all I'm doing now is cutting it out? It was interesting, actually. I was reading something this morning about Nietzsche. And it was really funny, because it was about the day that Nietzsche brought a typewriter. And it's funny, the idea of Nietzsche, typing away and learning to type. But apparently he was learning to type, and he got one of those old-fashioned typewriters. Anyway, and his friend asked Nietzsche what it was like for him to write on a typewriter. And Nietzsche said, actually, it made him much more aphoristic, i.e. he wrote shorter on a typewriter. And of course, when you look at the computer, you edit on the computer, and you can cut well. So you need all those skills. You need to cut, you need to put it in, and then you need to take it out. That's basically what we do all day. And then they pay you. But you see that with George Simenon. What I love about George Simenon and why I pass his books on to my students as a model of good writing is how reduced they are, how little there is there. They're just little dots of here and there, and he makes this whole world out of that. And you think, that's talent, that's genius.
But Simenon is I mean, I love Simenon. And if you count up the number of words he uses in French, he has a very small vocabulary.
Yeah.
But somehow he can do anything with it.
Yeah.
And that, do you think that it's a banal question, but in the digital age, has the ability to write and edit infinitely that work on screen allows you, has it made that ability to think in very disciplined, compact chunks of prose a bit more difficult?
I like long TV shows, but I hate long books. The first thing when I get a book and somebody sends a book round to my house is I look at this, look how long it is, don't you? Do you do that?
Yes.
You think, oh, I'm not reading that, bloody hell. I mean, even if it's really good, it puts you off a bit, I have to say. I mean, you can say it much shorter, in my view.
Yeah. You also talk about the way that writing is both work and fun. And it has to somehow go on being both.
It's really good fun, and it's incredibly boring. It's a really boring job. You are just sitting there for hours and hours and hours on behalf of the public. And at other times you think, this is the greatest job in the world. I can do whatever I like. I don't have to go out. I remember when I was younger, one of my sons came round and he saw me lying on the sofa. And he looked around at my room and my books, you know, and a computer and books and a chair, and he said, this is just your life, isn't it? He said in a rather contemptuous way. He said, this is just your life. I said, what do you mean? He said, this is it. You just sit in this room, don't you, all day? And then he said, you just lie on the sofa in the afternoons, don't you? Yeah. I said, yes. I said, and that's how I pay your fucking school fees as well. By doing this. And he thought it was a bit, you know, reduced. And now, funnily enough, he's become a writer himself, and all he does is sit in a room surrounded by books, looking out the window, thinking, God, this is boring, but actually this is better than having a proper job. Yeah.
You've been sitting in that room for quite a while now. Is it different does aging make any difference to the writing process?
Yeah, it does. It makes you hurry up a bit. Because every morning when you get up and you start to groan and ache, you think, I'll be dead soon. What do I want to really do with my life? And you think, well, I could drink a bottle of vodka now, couldn't I? Or I could go to Paris if I wanted, or I could do whatever. But actually, I like writing. I enjoy it. I feel more at ease with it now than I've ever done before, because I'm not so nervous about what other people are going to think and whether it's good or bad. I don't really give a shit anymore in that sense. I want it to be good, but I'm not, you know, let's say, over-nervous about it. I do my best, and I work really hard at it. I've got my own standards, but I'm not frightened in the way that, I mean, when you're young and trying to make a living as a writer, from someone like me, from my background, it seems amazing to me that I ever became a writer and did it my whole life and made a living at it. It just seems amazing to me that I did that. It's quite a tough thing to do. It's not like being a pop star where you can make a lot of money in one go. You know, you've got to make money over a long period of time quite regularly. It's been touch and go, I can tell you that. I wouldn't recommend it.
And if we talk about the difference, say, for a young writer or artist now wanting to dedicate a long-term career in the way that you have, what has changed? Is it more difficult if you compare the culture of the 70s and 80s where people lived on the dole or
I think it's much easier for writers of colour now. I think people are much more... Our books... I mean, you'd go into a bookshop and all the books by writers of colour... I remember, you know, you'd be in what was called... Do you remember this? The Commonwealth section.
Yeah. Yeah.
There'd always be a Commonwealth section in the bookshop, you know. And I remember Rushdie writing an essay condemning this because his books were in the so-called Commonwealth section, which would be in a little bit at the back where they'd put, really interesting writers of colour, and all the Graham Greene and Ian Forster and all the white writers who wrote about colonialism would be at the front of the book. So I think it's much easier for us in terms of people are more likely to read our books and see them as part of literature and not as some sort of, let's say, subsection of literature as we were seeing before. So that makes me rather optimistic for the new writers and their voices. Yeah.
And you mentioned that you have been in the position of teaching writing. How much of what you do is teachable?
You can teach everything apart from the bit that really matters. I mean, that's what's hell about it. I mean, all the books now, I like reading books about writing, like how to write a screenplay in 10 days. I love books like that. And it's a really good way of spending time without writing. It's a great way of not writing, of wasting time, I find. And anyway, they're all about the structure, and they're all about what should happen on page 11, on page 21, and then blah, blah, blah. And my kids go on about them. They always talk, they say, oh man, we're in our process. And you think, what process? But the bit that you can't teach is that blaze of life that a piece of writing has to have, and some of the students have it and most of the students don't have it. Sometimes you read 3 pages and you think, wow, this is really good. And the voice, and the individuality, the color, the sense of, of a world rushing at you is really invigorating, and some people just can't do that, however many lessons they go to. I mean, the thing about talent is you can't buy it. You just can't buy it. You can't go on a course and buy it. If there's a certain subject that you want to learn, you can go on a course and learn it. So a certain historical period, you can learn everything. You can buy that. But you can't buy that special magic thing. And I hate the idea that people think that they can buy it. You can purchase that and have that. You can't. And that's that magical thing, and I don't know how you get that. And that really bothers people because they think that in this day and age, you should be able to buy everything. You can go to a therapist and buy mental health, you can buy sexual health, you can buy this and that, but you can't buy that. You can't capitalize it, you can't turn it into a thing. And that makes people really crazy. It's as though they want to come and you teach them, and then they should be able to write a really good book. But you could teach them until you're blue in the face, and they couldn't. Some of them can, though, and that's what's brilliant.
Let's talk about your own work. You moved between so many different forms. You remade forms according to your own purposes and ambitions. We talked about long-form TV series, but are there any other literary or dramatic forms that you haven't yet worked in?
I think you should invent your form, I mean, you look at Beckett's later work. I mean, some of them are really short. Yeah. They're really weird. They're bits and pieces. Or you look at Carol Churchill's got a new play on at the Royal Court. I haven't seen it, but she's a very interesting writer, an innovative writer. I think as you get older, you just write, it might be that short, it might be that long, it might be this, it might be that shape, and you write it to whatever shape and size you want it to be. You might write a play that's 10 minutes long. Well, that's the right length for the play. It might be 4 hours long. The idea that you have to have a movie that's 2 hours or a novel that's 60,000 words and so on, it becomes irrelevant to you because, all that matters is that the story starts there and it ends there. So you can invent new forms, as it were, just out of necessity. And obviously you can do that on television now. There are TV shows where each episode is 10 minutes long, actually, which seems to me to be a really good idea. I want to see now a TV show where each episode is a different length, because that's how long it takes to do that bit and that bit and that bit. I rather like that idea. So the form will change with the imagination, according to the imagination of the artist, actually. It's the artist that should be dictating the form, structure, and length of things, rather than, the TV structure of the TV channel. Yeah. Should we do questions? You want to do questions?
Yes, that's... Okay,
towards the back. Yes, yes.
Hi, Hanif. I just want to say that I think Buddha of Suburbia is one of your best pieces, and I can't believe it's going to be 30 years old next year. It changed my life when I read it as a teenager, when I watched the BBC show. Have you ever thought about writing a follow-up, either a novel or a short story, about what happens to Karim 30 years on?
Well, I'm doing one now, but it's not funny, though. I'm writing one now, which is about a last meeting between Karim and there's a character in the story called Matthew Pike, who's a theatre director. And in the story, Matthew Pike gets busted for various, let's say, sexual abuses. And Karim goes to see him for the last time and says, you know, you were my mentor, my friend, but you know, you've been busted now and you've done these dirty things. But it's not really funny like the Buddha of Suburbia, because it's not funny at all. It's a tragic situation. So I'm writing it, but I don't really want to announce it, as it were, as a follow-up to the Buddha of Suburbia, and people reading it thinking they're going to have a good time, because they're not going to have a good time when they read the story. You know, it's quite dark and quite grim. And those are the only two characters that could you know, that I can think of at the moment that could come together. All the other characters are all dead, they've spread, they've gone here and there, you know. But those two get together at the end, and I'm writing it. And it's quite, I don't even know if I'll publish it. I've been working on it a lot. I don't even know if I'll publish it. It's quite a sad thing at the end. It's not, it doesn't have that spirit and energy that the Buddha of Suburbia has, but then why should it? But then you have to write as you write, you know, and if it's miserable, it's miserable. So I'm sorry to say that I am actually fulfilling your desire, but it's not, it isn't going to be much fun. It's fun for me to write, though. That's all that matters.
Right at the front, yeah. That's.
Hanif, could you share on your experience of your creative writing? Because I want to know specifically in your experience in teaching creative writing, if you have any specific examples that come to mind of actually watching your students transform during the time you've been with them and then finding their voice. I have a deep political reason for asking this. When I was on Parliament Square 8 weeks ago, and I was standing in between the pro-Brexiters and the anti-Brexiters, and I saw something that chilled me to the bone, which was the hatred of word and the inarticulateness of those who had no voice but to borrow the voices of nationalism. And that started me thinking about how one can help the voiceless to find their voice.
I've got two students who are really good, one last year and one this year. And that's quite a high percentage, you know. That's really good. A guy last year wrote a really good book. But I didn't make him talented. I've told him to cut this and move that around and do that if he wants to do it. But I didn't make him talented, and he's writing about his family. He's written a beautiful novel, and he's very good with words. He knows how to write. But I can't tell you how he knows that. One of the things the students don't do, the good students should do, and some of them actually do, is to read. It's amazing how little they read. I mean, when I was a kid, I read all the time. I have to say there wasn't much else to do in Bromley in the 1960s. Apart from read books, there wasn't much else entertainment except, you know, banging a nail into your forehead with a hammer. But if you want to get a sense of craft and how to structure a story and tell a story, it's a really good idea to read other people's stories. And it's amazing how often you have to tell the students to do that, actually. How you know, I said to a guy the other day, you should read Simenon. He said, who? I thought, well, come on, mate. You know, you should have heard of Georges Simenon, you know, at least of Maigret and so on and so on. But you really have to push them to read. And that's where you get, you would learn an instinct for storytelling, let's say, by reading thousands of other people's stories. You wouldn't have to learn that from a book. You'd hear that from your mum telling you a story, and then, you know, reading other people's telling stories, and then telling stories to your own kids, for instance. It should be quite instinctive.
Right
at the back, yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Hanif, and thank you, Boyd. Hello, Boyd. You kind of answered my question. But partially. I'm a mixed-race writer from Vancouver, and I write mainly in war zones, but about Iraq. But I'm teaching here at an institution where most of the department is rather monochromatic, but my students are less so. So I'm glad to know that you don't think that creative writing is at higher education is a complete waste of time, and that there are sparks.
Not at all. I don't think so at all.
But I'm interested to know if you think that there'll be sort of a bit of a sea change in terms of the departments themselves. And also I was very interested in what you said about cosmopolitanism in London giving way or being diminished by money, because I'm from a city with a sort of housing crisis and a real estate war as well.
Well, the universities are mostly interested in money, and the teachers are mostly interested in the students. And many of the students are being driven away because it's too expensive, really expensive. 2 of my kids went to university, right? And now both of them have got debts of 50 grand, right? I mean, and they're 25, 26. It's a nightmare to have done that to somebody in their mid-20s, and they got a reasonably good education. But they've got this millstone around their necks that's a horrible thing. And the other thing is that they also now, they take anybody. So you get a lot of students who really shouldn't be there. And it's rather embarrassing because they take them because they're paying, you know, so it's become more like Tesco's with books. Very few books, but at least some books. And so it is difficult, but there is something good that can happen between a teacher and a student. And if someone comes to you and says, I want to learn, then you want to teach them. That's beautiful. That's a really good thing. The whole structure of the university thing is a bit of a problem for me. I'm quite a rebellious and difficult person, lazy also. Perfect for a modern university, but I wouldn't discount teaching, no, at all.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yeah. This isn't the question, but I believe you did bring Charlie and Kareem into a book called Something to Talk About. It's like they kind of came in as a party. But the question was, you're obviously a huge fan of music. How did you feel in '77 when punk arrived? I remember I was like 22 and I felt 102. How did you feel about that, what they call ground zero, that schism at the time?
I loved punk. I must have been, I just left. I was in my last year at university. So I was in London and I was working at the Royal Court, and the King's Road was on fire with so-called punk. And I was very aware of what's going on, and Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren, what they were doing, and so on. And it's a great movement. It was a really great movement. It was really lively and really funny, and it was, at the time, it was mostly working class as well. It wasn't middle class like rock and roll had been, actually. And I loved the spirit of it. And it's the only movement, really, that's still alive, you might say. You know, you talk about people being punky, and there are programs on the TV all the time about punk. It's a really important period. And I was writing something about, I was thinking the other day about what I loved about Britain. As you get older, you become rather nostalgic like that. And I thought, what I love is music and the young people, the creativity of this country, actually. What would I say if people said to me, what is being British? You know, do you think about the Queen or Henry VIII or whatever? And I think about music, the creativity of young people, fashion, photography, music, all how lively all that is. That's what I love about, and particularly Bowie. And there's a long essay in the book about Bowie, who I knew and worked with a bit for about 3 years. Any more?
Another.
Any more questions? One more question. 2 more questions?
At the front here, yes.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure listening to you, because I'm a huge fan of your books. You capture the theme of casual racism from the 70s and 80s beautifully in the interviews you've given and in the books that you've written. What do you think has been the turning point from that casual racism to turn into the political racism that we're seeing in the world today? What do you think has brought about that evolution?
What was the turning point? That's a very good question. Why has it become, I think, a real kind of despair, really. I mean, populism comes out, populism is a tribute to a failed revolution, you might say. It's a despair, isn't it? Populism. And at the center of populism is a kind of hatred, really, the pleasure of hatred. And that seems to me to be a terrible kind of despair, really, and a feeling of failure and impotence that you can't change the ruling class, you can't change the financial system, but you can hate a group who you imagine have done you wrong, which may be a religious group or a group of a different color, or Muslims, or whoever it is. And it seems to me to be a kind of despair. The other night when I was watching the Bulgaria-England game, and you saw all the Bulgarians giving the Nazis salutes, etc., and then being taken out of the ground, the question that nobody has really asked, and everybody's been talking about how appalling it was, the question nobody has really asked is, why are they doing this? How come they're in such despair in various parts of Eastern Europe? They tried communism, they turned to capitalism, and now they think fascism is a good idea. What kind of despair must that be, that you would think that by abusing Raheem Sterling somehow that this will make an improvement to your life? It seemed to me to be terribly sad, apart from the fact it's vile and cruel and stupid. It seemed to me to be rather wretched that this is your idea of political agency, and that seemed to me to be a question that's really worth thinking about, actually. Why would you think that hating Raheem Sterling will ever get you anywhere or do anything good for you in the long run? And that seemed to me to be terrible. One more question, and then we must go home and watch television.
Right at the back.
Hello, Hanif.
Hiya.
I apologise if somebody's asked this question because I just walked in a few minutes ago. You've kind of touched on this in your last answer, conflating Islam with Islamist extremism, so-called, i.e. the interchangeable way that the media portrays Islam as Islamism. You're one of the few people, or probably only person, who was writing about religious extremists, i.e. people who call themselves Muslims, my son the fanatic, etc. So the media particularly conflates the two. What's your view?
I mean, the brand of Islam, of being a Muslim, has really been contaminated, and not only by the media, but by, let's say, the rude people that took it over and so abused it, particularly since the fatwa, that they were calling for the death of an author in the name of Islam. That didn't do Islam many favors. Certainly the religion, and I'm not a big fan of religions, I have to say, you would have to work hard to decontaminate that. Certainly the media regards Islam certainly from a position of pure prejudice and stupidity. But I think Muslims themselves really have to show us that why it would be that there is anything good in this religion. I'm prepared to entertain that, but I'd like to hear the arguments, and I haven't heard them so far, because these guys, mostly these guys, attacked my friend Salman Rushdie, an exemplary artist, for writing a book that they didn't like, and threatened to kill him, and indeed locked him up almost for 10 years. And I want to hear a really good argument why anybody would have a good thing to say about Islam after that, and I'll be prepared to entertain it. But at the moment, I'm not very favorably disposed to this religion after what it did to Rushdie and to the offices of Charlie Hebdo, and so on and so on. I'm prepared to entertain that this isn't a representative picture of all Muslims. Clearly, that's not the case. But at the moment, I'm not very keen on that religion for those reasons. Okay.
Okay. Well, that's we've had an evening which has touched on so many things. It has, I hope, given you a flavour of Hanif's writing in what happened. The great thing, if you go out and buy it now, and he will even sign a copy, is that you will be able to continue the conversation by reading the essays and stories in this book. It's been fantastic to have Hanif here. As always, he's provided not just food for thought, but an absolute banquet, which I hope you will go on savouring. So thank you for coming, and most of all, thanks to Hanif.
Thank you, man. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.